This is the Elements of Science Fiction video series, and in this video we are going to look at War of the Worlds and Freudian analysis. The Steven Spielberg adaptation of War of the Worlds and the original H.G. Wells novella suggests there is an animalistic tendency that dwells somewhere deep within the human psyche.
No one would have believed in the early years of the 21st century that our world was being watched by intelligences greater than our own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they observed.
We are really good at suppressing this so we can go about our ordinary business and build complex and intricate things without resorting to these base instincts. But this doesn't mean that it isn't impinging upon our thoughts and lives, or at the very least our imaginations. This concept was later made popular by the theories of Sigmund Freud as a balance between the id and the ego, and these tendencies are so indelible to the human condition that an entire school of literary criticism exists in the name of Freudian analysis. What I find so interesting about War of the Worlds, despite its honor as the very first work of hard science fiction in English literature, where intricate details explain both the plausibility and viability of Martian physiology and technology, it's how elements of Freudian analysis are imparted not so much to the nameless main character, but to the human society at large. This is made apparent in the opening scene of the Spielberg adaptation, with overhead shots of mass population centers. Once stripped of our civilizing elements, namely having the needs of the Maslow hierarchy stripped all the way down to being unable to care for our very mortal safety needs, we become as animals. This might come as no surprise. We've seen real-life humans as well as literary characters resort to this sort of thing when confronted by such threats, but what makes War of the Worlds interesting is that it recognizes humans are social animals as well. Not pack animals or herd animals, but social on a massive scale. Like ants. Our story begins in London. In the Spielberg adaptation, San Francisco. What these two cities share in common is, 1, large populations made sustainable by technology. Cities are, after all, technological achievements which require a complex network of support in order to have such dense populations. 2nd, they are wildly safe. Sure, there's crime and all that, but there isn't that existential threat of total imminent annihilation that has accompanied humans for most of history. The threat of some foreign enemy simply marching over the hill and slaughtering everyone in sight. This freedom from fear is a comfort unique to the modern age, one that 19th century London enjoyed every bit as much as San Francisco today. The whole nuclear predicament notwithstanding, and hey, let's be honest, we don't think about nuclear war like we did in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So we see right from the start how the Tom Cruise character laughs and enjoys the fireworks of the Martian phenomenon. No way that the weather can hurt you, right? Spielberg is keen to keep this in mind, and War of the Worlds is about how the slow unraveling of safety and the impact of death, real, utter, complete destruction on massive populations of people. H.G. Wells looked at 19th century London and said, "Dang, what if all these people had to bolt all at once? It'd be bedlam. They'd stampede and trample each other." Wells writes of a boiling stream of people, a torrent of human beings, one pressing on another. In the Spielberg adaptation, we see people claw through windshields like crazed zombies, too possessed by fear to worry about cutting themselves on the glass. Hence, War of the Worlds is a speculative work on mass panic, and incidentally, each and every zombie movie is about the same, as the zombie is nothing more than the human devoid of consciousness, devoid of anything but pure animal instinct. Scenes of ordinary life, of crowds gathering and gawking, fast turn into fear-induced violence, all expertly shot in classic Spielberg fashion. We even have the onlookers shooting pictures and capturing video, lulled into a false sense of security by the camera lens. Like with War of the Worlds, the novella, we find the last thing on the minds of the crowd of onlookers is the threat of annihilation. Even when looking the towering Martian tripod face to face, people give it space, but nobody really thinks to run until it starts laying waste to everyone in their path. And at this point, well, society crumbles into dust and blows away. The instinct for survival overrides altruism. Oh, and by the way, Tom Cruise's character protecting his children is also an act of instinct. Whereas the Tim Robbins character protecting them in his basement is a genuine act of altruism. And like the Curate character in the War of the Worlds novella, his unraveling into psychosis is representative of the inability to reconcile altruism with utter annihilation. He represents the obliteration of reason and logic in the face of all of this.
Shit. Please. My daughter. Think about it. They defeated the greatest power in the world in a couple days. Walked right over us. And these are only the first. They'll keep coming. This is not a war any more than there's a war between men and maggots. This is an extermination.
And the Tom Cruise character's act of murder is one of necessity for survival, and symbolic of the death of reason in the name of survival, when humans have been turned from the peak creature on this planet to just another animal that can be wiped out by one superior than themselves. Of course, in the novella, the curate's death represents the death of both morality and religion when mankind is faced with the prospect of extinction. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche proposed that the simple existence of rationalism and science portends the end of religion. What he famously argued was the death of God. Another thing 19th century London shares in common with today's San Francisco, or today's any major city really, is life with the Industrial Revolution. What the Industrial Revolution had just recently delivered to Wells' world in the 1890s was the arrival of mechanized warfare. The fear that these massive billowing machines, the ocean steamliner, the ironclad floating fortress, the railroad locomotive, the factory, these were all dangerous and could one day use to be killed enormous swaths of human beings. And though in Wells' time they had yet to do so, War of the Worlds is very much a prognostication of the horrors of the First World War, which I don't believe was named as a parody of Wells' novella, but did witness many elements depicted in the novel. Massive machines piloted by soft, squishy, vulnerable creatures on the inside, toxic gas used as a weapon of mass destruction, and death on a scale never before conceived of in all of previous human history. And though I said we don't go through our daily lives worried about imminent death by foreign invasion, all the accoutrements of industrial technology are very much as deadly as they were in Wells' time, if not more so. And even though we haven't seen the destruction of massive population centers done in the name of a sovereign nation since World War II, we have seen the scale of destruction possible through the misuse of modern technology. And this is with us, deep within the recesses of our unconscious minds, what you may call a subconscious worry. One that we are able to largely ignore, but one that nonetheless resides in our unconscious. And perhaps this is why the blockbuster disaster movie, heck, just about every superhero movie, involves the unraveling of urban population centers through mass destruction, because this resonates within the deep recesses of our minds. That thought that wonders what would happen if all of this just came to a sudden and chaotic collapse. That word, collapse, an entire paradigm of social criticism exists in the name of anticipating and preparing for just such a contingency, and what living in the presence of its inevitability does to affect our daily lives. Check out the archives of the C-Realm podcast on this subject, and it's not paranoia or psychosis that drives people to address this worry, though we can poke fun at some of the extraordinary lengths people have gone to in order to mitigate the threat. But the fact is, modern life is exceedingly vulnerable to external stress, and extraordinarily reliant upon a complex network of systems all working at peak capacity. War of the Worlds is about this fear, about this reality. The Martians serve only as an allegory to the severe devastation we as a species are capable of wreaking upon ourselves. After all, we have witnessed mankind's ability to wreak devastation upon other species, but that does not exclude our own. Wells writes on page 3 of the novella, "And before we judge of them too harshly, the Martians, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its own inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. War of the Worlds is not without humbling of all this technology. This reminds me of a quote from George Carlin, where he too criticizes the meddlesome worries brought on by modern technology.
See, I'm not one of these people who's worried about everything. You got people like this around you. Country's full of them now. People walking around all day long, every minute of the day, worried about everything. Worried about the air, worried about the water, worried about the soil. Worried about insecticides, pesticides, food additives, carcinogens. Worried about radon gas, worried about asbestos. Worried about saving endangered species. Let me tell you about endangered species, all right? Saving endangered species is just one more arrogant attempt by humans to control nature.
Of course, Carlin's point is that it is a supreme act of arrogance to presume we as a species possess either the power to destroy or save the planet because it exists on a scale far too grand, far too resilient, and far too old for us to have any ultimate power over. And rather than argue the many ways in which Carlin is wrong here, notice how he mentions viruses at the end of his bit.
Can be phased out now, and I think that's really started already, don't you? I mean, to be fair, the planet probably sees us as a mild threat, something to be dealt with, and I'm sure the planet will defend itself in the manner of a large organism, like a beehive or an ant colony can muster a defense. I'm sure the planet will think of something. What would you do if you were the planet trying to defend against this pesky, troublesome species? Let's see, what might... viruses. Viruses might...
This is also where Wells leaves us at the end of War of the Worlds, that human ingenuity and perseverance is not a psychological or intelligence test, but one of nature itself. And yes, humans are a part of nature. We are animals, after all. And it is by virtue of our participation in the gene swarm of life altogether that we possess the tools to survive in the face of an existential threat. For so it had come about, as indeed I and many men might have foreseen had not terror and disaster blinded our minds. These germs of disease have taken toll of humanity since the beginning of things, taken toll of our pre-human ancestors since life began here. But by virtue of this natural selection of our kind, we have developed resisting power. To no germs do we succumb without a struggle, and to many, those that cause putrefaction and dead matter, for instance, our living frames are altogether immune. But there are no bacteria in Mars, and directly these invaders arrived, directly they drank and fed, our microscopic allies began to work their overthrow. Already, when I watched them, they were irrevocably doomed, dying and rotting even as they went to and fro. It was inevitable. By the toll of 1 billion deaths, man has bought his birthright of the earth, and it is against all comers. It would still be his were the Martians 10 times as mighty as they are, for neither do men live nor die in vain. And this was slightly altered here in the voiceover from Morgan Freeman.
From the moment the invaders arrived, breathed our air, ate and drank, they were doomed. They were undone, destroyed, after all of man's weapons and devices had failed, by the tiniest creatures that God in his wisdom put upon this earth. By the toll of 1 billion deaths, man had earned his immunity, his right to survive among this planet's infinite organisms. And that right is ours against all challenges, for neither do men live nor die in vain.